has demonstrated deep commitment to work together to solve the challenges facing us. And this is against the backdrop of a WTO and world trading system that's facing huge challenges. And these include the decision-making system that has been stymied, the dispute resolution system which is not functioning due to the appeal system not working. The rules are not responsive to the current realities of e-commerce and digitalization of trade and economic activity. This world clearly wants to see a multilateral trading system that is stable, that is responsive to modern challenges of digital trade, and that delivers on sustainability and development. I will set out three anchors of the approach we are taking to deal both with domestic structural challenges and global economic headwinds. Firstly, reclaiming multilateralism to deliver shared gains. Secondly, an industrial policy built on decarbonization, diversification, and digitalization. And thirdly, a pragmatic trade diversification strategy. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the question that we in South Africa must now grapple with is whether we want to play a leading role in defining what the future of trade looks like. And there are a few things that we ought to do in this regard. In the immediate, we must resist the forces of protectionism. These forces, potent as they are underpinned by a facade of national security logic, but in reality are a reflection of transactional politics. When we assumed the presidency of the WTO at the end of 2024, we were deliberate in underscoring solidarity, equality, and sustainable development. We have been consistent in various G20 engagements that the future of the world can only be secured through deeper international cooperation. Now, I was going to spend a bit of time talking about industrial policy, but I assumed, of course, that I was requested to talk about the boring subject of trade because, of course, the organizers, like many South Africans, are concerned about developments internationally and how we're responding to them. And as I said, our first response relates to the World Trade Organization, where, in fact, the ministerial conference taking place next year in Yaoundé, Cameroon, is possibly responding to a point that Ayabonga made earlier. What is the next phase of trade, and under which regime will it take place? Will we acknowledge the reality of a deteriorating amount of trade happening under a rules-based WTO system that has now reduced from 80% to 72%, our trade that's happening under a rules-based system? Or will we be able to salvage a form of a rules-based system under the circumstances? Of course, these matters are not easy. They are in themselves complex issues. For indeed, anybody that engages in trade negotiations negotiates primarily on behalf of their country, continent, region, or at least a network of countries with which you work. Part of the reality is that with a dysfunctional system, we need to answer the question, what are the intervening measures in an environment where you have instability to at least salvage some form of rules and controls and ensure that those who wish to subscribe to a rules-based system are at least able to trade amongst themselves based on a set of rules. How that happens is likely to be a complex subject for South Africa in particular, amongst the countries that have been very vocal and vociferous in our opposition to what is called plurilateralism, or plurilaterals, which are agreements that are ratified in the WTO, but essentially happens amongst countries that are in agreement on the rules that you develop, whether for trade and investment, whether for the digital economy and so on. And that question, I think, has been thrown to us between Thursday and Friday by the majority of trade ministers that were there to say, how do you respond to the reality of an evolving trade environment where South Africa has held a position that says we need to defend the multilateral system, and people are saying, but it's not working. What do we do? So it's a complexity that we ourselves are going to have to respond to. But I'm sure you would have wanted us to comment more about the more contemporary issues that we relate to in relation to trade. Currently, South Africa's exports are overly concentrated in three main partners. These are the United States, the European Union, and China. We will keep these relationships strong, but we must broaden our footprint. That means embracing carefully sequenced bilateral trade agreements that go beyond tariffs into services, digital trade, investment, intellectual property, standards, and climate cooperation. These are new vectors of global commerce. Now, there are three concrete pathways that illustrate our intent to bolster South African competitiveness. And we start, of course, with our key trading partners. As you would have seen or observed, on Thursday, the President of South Africa and the President of the EU Commission were able to unveil what is called the Clean Trade and Investment Partnership, and an investment pipeline of about 12 billion euro, circa some 240 plus billion rand into the South African economy. This is premised, amongst others, on a commitment to ensure that you move from the orientation of pit to port or mining to sea to get it to a point where you are able to beneficiate the minerals at source or as close to source as possible. That's the first commitment. The second commitment is to ensure that industrialization happens in South Africa as opposed to a situation where our trade relationship is premised on moving goods out of this country into the EU with limited investments by the EU into the South African economy. It's a significant shift in the trading relationship that we have with the European Union. And we anticipate that a program attached to this would be unveiled at the G20 Heads of State Summit in November. The second relates to our relationship with China, Ambassador. Indeed, the Chinese have made a pronouncement that 53 countries, African countries that have a bilateral relationship with them, diplomatic relations, formal diplomatic relations, would get 0% tariffs into the Chinese market for all products. Now, that on its own is a significant commitment to trading with us. Of course, there are issues that we have to deal related to that. And amongst others, you have to deal with sanitary and phytosanitary conditions. You have to deal with standards. You have to ensure that the standard bodies are able to talk to each other. You have to ensure that what we measure is the same as what the Chinese measure. So there are all sorts of complexities, but we are also not naive to the reality that, in fact, the Chinese produce at much lower cost than most countries in the world. So when you're talking about access, you need to be strategic about which goods, which products, and which services you're targeting the Chinese market for. But you need to take advantage of that opportunity. But linked to that is an offer from the Chinese to enter into a discussion around green mining and industrialization. I'm adding, Ambassador, industrialization, because every time I say green mining, Minister Mantashe, like President Motlanthe, are former general secretaries of the National Union of Mine Workers. And he says, no, there's nothing green about mining. It's dirty, it's dangerous, they've got 5 Ds. So we add industrialization simply to make the point that the relationship is premised on a commitment to ensure that industrialization happens here. That in fact you are able to link your minerals to industrialization and be able to produce in South Africa. So it's a new form of relationship that's evolving with China around what the relationship could be. As you'd see, I was a bit dispassionate earlier talking about the Chinese and the Europeans, and both of them are here, so I need to be nice to them now. But the point I'm emphasizing is, of course, a commitment to ensure that when we're talking about industrialization and reindustrialization in South Africa, it is taking into account the reality that we've got the minerals, they've got the capital and technologies. And yes, we need to evolve our own intellectual capital, but some of it we can buy, some of it we can source, some of it we can bring through investments. And that's the approach we're taking. Of course, we have a similar arrangement with the Japanese, focused in particular on green hydrogen and ammonia, that's focusing on ensuring that we're able to invest in green hydrogen and ammonia. And the same applies to the European Union. Now, of course, it would be incomplete if I didn't say the United States of America. And I have to say the things I've been saying publicly. We're at a sensitive stage of the negotiations. We're at a sensitive stage of the negotiations, but we're at a point where we're at least on the verge of negotiating an agreement around tariffs and an agreement around how this can be reciprocally beneficial as opposed to the historic way in which this has been presented, and historic meaning the most recent history. Of course, there are hot button issues. There are hot button issues chanting what the Americans consider uncomfortable. Of course, it's uncomfortable in our context, it's part of our history, but there's the chant that there's been a particularly topical issue. Of course, there are issues around the so-called genocide of Afrikaners, and therefore they need to allow a mechanism to allow Afrikaners to go to exile. And that you would have a Kenyan NGO coming to administer this process in South Africa. So it's a hot button issue. Some of those issues we're dealing with. But on the trade side, we're beginning to make significant progress. But we're equally starting to talk seriously about investments. We're equally talking about how we can leverage off our respective capabilities as countries. Now, I make these points because South Africa is a small, open economy. In many ways, as we enter into these discussions and agreements, we need to accept that, in fact, we can't develop a system that becomes exclusive to one to the detriment of the other. We're an economy where investors come, they identify opportunities, and within the rules of the country, they're able to invest. But also an economy that has its own ambitions. And thus the emphasis of shifting from a position where these investments happen outside a defined framework of growth and development to be investments that happen within the context of an overarching industrial policy and strategy. Now, I didn't spend time talking about industrial policy and strategy, but simply wanted to emphasize on the points on trade and the trade environment, and to also say, as a parting shot, a focus on maximizing the exploitation of our assets. And particularly, these are our critical minerals. But indeed, as Mauricio comes to the podium, it is also a bit risky to suggest that we do not beneficiate at all. We're worried about what's happening in steel, Bonang. We're completely worried. The Europeans have just slapped a 50% tariff on steel. It's going to have a huge impact. The Americans have 50%. China has oversupply. We have all sorts of problems in steel. But the reality is that we are beneficiating steel. We're intervening in the industry because we want to continue beneficiation. And as I conclude, as Mantashe says, every time you switch on a light, it is beneficiation of coal in our country. Thank you very much.
On the stage, the judges will be like a few questions for you. Okay. Just a few points. We're now going to proceed with the fireside chat facilitated by JJ for 20 minutes. How many minutes, Mrs. Motlanthe? 15 minutes. We then proceed to the breakaway commissions, geopolitics, trade and investment, critical minerals in the summit room, education, training and skills development, Zankel's room, clean energy and technology in the Amplet room. Once again this evening there will be pre-dinner drinks from SAB and Pernod Ricard, and tomorrow we start at 10 minutes to 9. Please enjoy your dinner this evening once again.
All right.
Thank you, JJ.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good evening. Good evening. All right, wonderful. No, we're going to engage with the minister. I'm going to ask him one or two questions, and then we're going to get a few of you to join in the fireside chat. Thank you so much, Minister, for gracing us with your presence. A lot of people curious at the moment about what's going on with the trade negotiations with the U.S. Just take advantage of being here, just on a highlights level. There seems to be a panic that things are moving a little bit slowly, and we're also, looks like we're overtaken by events in as far as the expiry of AGOA is concerned. Just kick us off with that, just broad update about, just give us a sense of confidence around it. Is it something you're confident that it's going to be sorted out, or are we going south?
Well, firstly, let me make the point around AGOA. AGOA, of course, is an act of Congress, so it has to be passed by Congress. And even in our engagement with the administration, they continue to say, but it's a matter of Congress. Of course, the reality is that some in Congress are also waiting for a signal from the White House. And I think the signal has come out to say the White House will not oppose. But the reality is that there's been an emphasis on the bilateral engagements, and some of the issues have fallen by the wayside, and AGOA is one of those that suffered that fate. As we understand it, it is going to go to Congress as soon as possible, but you would know it has to be attached to another bill. So it's not going to go on its own, it will be attached to another bill, which we hope it gets attached to another bill because it enables it to gain traction in terms of speed for consideration. And we are hoping that between now and November, that matter would be concluded. But ultimately, it's within the hands of Congress. The feedback we receive is generally positive. But anything can happen between now and the point at which it is passed, and our responsibility is to continue to lobby for AGOA. With regards to the bilateral engagements, there was a point at which, and we did address the country and indicated that we've reached a